Hello, everyone. This is Terry O'Quinn. I played Sheriff Joe Haller in the 1985 film Silver Bullet, and I know a thing or two about hunting werewolves. So, let me welcome you to Brian P. Easton's Werewolf Bar and Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. I'm Brian Easton, author of the Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series, and this is the Werewolf Bar. Special thanks to Terry O'Quinn for the introduction this evening. Sheriff Joe Haller from Silver Bullet has always been a favorite character of mine. So our creature of the night is a little special. Last summer, I had the opportunity to stop by the George Dickel distillery down in Tennessee. One of the things I picked up while I was there was this bottle of single barrel small batch 103 proof whiskey. That's 51.5%. Now, it's aged 9 years and, of course, distilled there in Cascade Hollow in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Now, this bottle is number 133 in the batch and has a barrel date of June 7th, 2010 on this little wooden tag that it's got around its neck. Now, I have not made any secret that George Dickel is my favorite brand of whiskey of any type. And as you can see, this bottle has not yet been opened. So I've been looking forward to this taste ever since last July. So we're going to open up our creature of the night. And toast to you. Okay, first let me say this. Any single barrel whiskey, your mileage is going to vary, barrel to barrel. But this hits all the right notes. And the high alcohol content is no surprise. I mean, it does deliver a punch. But it doesn't overwhelm, and it has a kind of a layered texture to it, layered flavors. I mean, there's kind of a smell of wintergreen and some apple, kind of tart apple notes to it, and it's an exceptional whiskey, and I expected nothing less from the folks down in Cascade Hollow. And it's a perfect example and kind of a validation in a way of why George Dickel is my favorite whiskey across the board. Well, Thanksgiving is just a few weeks away. The days of 2021 quickly on their way out. It just doesn't seem possible that another year has passed us by, but it's been a good year here at the Werewolf Bar. We participated in my hometown's Big Muddy Monster Project, and we brought you the Legends of the Monster Hunter anthology, which, by the way, if you haven't read, is available on Amazon, both as ebook and hard copy. And if you haven't picked that up yet, I encourage you to do so. If you're a fan of the series, you're gonna like this anthology too. I'll bet. So and leave us a review if you get a chance. All the guys who contributed really worked hard to bring you some of the best stories about werewolf hunting out there, and we'd all appreciate a good review. Hopefully it's nothing short of 5 stars. But with the anthology behind me now, behind us, that's going to free up a lot of my creative time so I can concentrate on delivering book 2 of the Winter Fox Journals, which will hopefully be coming your way this time next year. That's my goal. and not an unreasonable one, seeing as how I figure I'm probably about halfway through the book anyway. So, but while I was focusing on that, I kind of found myself becoming reacquainted with some of those unpublished manuscripts that I showed you a few jumps back. And I thought it might be interesting in a kind of an experiment to do a segment on the show that we could kind of think of as a tale around the campfire, a kind of thing where I would do to the best of my ability, read to you some of those stories out of those unpublished manuscripts. Now, let me add some disclaimers from the outset. First of all, these are pretty raw stories. And by that, I mean they've been unedited by anyone other than myself, which means they're unedited. And except for the last one, there's 6 in total, and except for the last one, they've all been written on a typewriter. So which means that if they're composed on a typewriter, I don't have the ability to just go back and edit huge swaths of text without using a lot of eraser ribbon and or just retyping the page from the beginning and starting over, which no one ever liked to do that. Also keep in mind that these were written, they're about 30 years ago or so. And so the writing itself is going to reflect that. It's going to be a throwback to that time, and it's going to lack the experience that I've accumulated in those succeeding decades. And so hopefully what you'll hear won't be as good as what I'm writing now. And in 30 years, what I'll write won't be as good as what I'm writing in 2021. But with that in mind, and as cringeworthy as it might be, I've decided to give it a whirl. Also keep in mind that what you're about to hear is non-canon. The stories, elements, and characters, a lot of which may have been incorporated and changed in my published works. So if you hear something familiar, this is where it probably started out with some of these things. So I'm going to start off this experiment of reading you these stories on my second manuscript, which was called Dark Rivers Run. And it takes place after Sylvester's encounter with the Wendigo, picks up about where Heart of Scars picked up in the published editions. So now I'm no audiobook narrator by any means, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And I'll read about 20 minutes of this story, and then we'll see how that goes. If there's interest, we'll pick it up again next time and continue the story till we're done, and then move on to the next one if there's interest. So here we go with a story called Spirits in the Silence.
Logan, Dark Rivers Run by Brian Easton, Book 2 in the Sylvester Logan James Saga. Part 1, Spirits in the Silence. If I'm not the only person on earth that hunts what I do, then why am I the last one to know when things start going bump in the night? I think it's because no one wants to admit to themselves or anyone else that sometimes the nightmares from their childhood are a stark reality. It's human nature, I guess, to deny what you can't cope with. Still, I'm always a little bugged when I'm finally contacted and just a little too late. I'll set the stage. In midsummer of 1990, I was forced to close down Silver Bullet Enterprises. All the sweat and trouble I'd invested wasn't worth the lease to the property now. The cash flow had dwindled to a trickle just before it stopped completely. The demand for a werewolf stalker had bottomed out. I was flat broke by the time the paperwork was finished, and Joanna had married a banker from Calgary a few months before I had to file bankruptcy. More than anything, I attributed my failure to losing her. Often I'd asked myself if I should have latched onto her when I had the chance, but even now I can't say for sure. Tanya was taking new directions in her life, too, appointed as head of the Prime Minister's security team, which left the directorship of covert operations to the guiding hand of Andrew Hillary. With both of my girlfriends gone from my life and the dickhead from beyond running things at CO, it was a sad state of affairs all around. Andy and I had butted heads before, but our last confrontation earned me a suspension without pay. So I packed up my things into the one vehicle the bank had let me keep, an '86 Silverado, and I headed west for British Columbia. August 23rd, 1990, I rolled into the ski town of Skowak around 7 in the morning. Things were already active for a town its size and population, just under 1,000 people. It still looked like 1976 here, with outdated advertisements and early model vehicles. But the anachronisms weren't unusual. In fact, Skowak fit the description of most small Canadian burgs with populations under 1,500. I'd never been to BC before, and even though the scenery was nice, it was nothing compared to places like Jasper and Banff back home in Alberta. The Chevy's engine had been rattling for the last several miles, so my first stop was a place called Levi's Auto Repair and Supply. The sign in his smeared windows said, "Come on in, we're open," and I walked inside to meet the man sitting behind the newspaper. I zipped up my flannel vest to better hide the .45 bulge in the small of my back, and pulled my old Stetson down around my ears. One of the drawbacks of being suspended is not being able to carry a weapon anywhere you want, legally. The gentleman at the desk looked over his paper when I walked through the door, and smiled through his missing upper incisors. "Morning," he sputtered. "Morning," I returned. "You Levi?" "How'd you guess?" he said, lowering his paper. "I got a pickup outside that's been rattling like a busted chainsaw. Can you take a look at it?" He folded the news and pulled himself out of his chair. "That's what I'm here for. Let's see what we've got." I started the engine and popped the hood while he propped it up and leaned into it. He motioned for me to shut it off after a minute or two. He was checking out my plates when I climbed out of the cab. "Manitoba, eh? Never been there. Of course, I never been a lot of places. I was born right here," he added, almost proudly. I nodded politely. "Is she going to live or not?" "Sounds like a bad lifter to me. I could probably get it lined out before noon," he said, pulling a rag from his pocket. "Sounds good. I'm in town for a few days anyway." "Are you?" he asked, almost accusingly. "You sound surprised." "We just don't get many visitors before the lodge opens. I don't see no ski racks on your truck anyway. You got friends here or something?" he asked, and then he blew his nose into a soiled rag in his pocket. "Not exactly," I said, "but I am looking for someone. Maybe you know him." I rummaged through my pockets and produced a crumpled envelope from inside my vest. I handed it to Levi and pointed the name in the upper left-hand corner. "Ever heard of him?" The name was Samuel Vargo, Skowak, BC. No address. He handed it back to me with an odd expression on his face. "Old Sam's been dead about 3 months," he informed me. A part of me was not surprised. "What happened?" I asked. "Heart attack or something like that." "How did you know him?" I replaced the letter inside my jacket pocket. "I didn't, really," I admitted. "Any relatives around?" "Not that I ever heard of. Sam lived out in the woods by himself. Good fella, kind of a strange duck. I didn't know the old codger knew how to write," as he stuffed the rag away. "And you say he had a heart attack?" "That's the word. Sheriff found his body this last June. He could tell you for sure. You some kind of reporter? Something?" "Not me," I said. Levi continued to talk, but I don't think I heard a word he said. I'd been distracted by other things. Across the street walked a woman of breathtaking beauty. She wasn't dressed nice or even overly groomed, but she caught my attention and kept it. She was about 5'6", 5'7", with wild blonde hair and a leather braid holder. She wore loose-fitting jeans and a cotton rose-colored shirt, topped with a rawhide fringed vest and some beads or something around her neck. I smiled discreetly when she looked my way, but she just turned her head and walked into the general store. I realized that Levi had been watching her as well. "Jessie Lucas," he said in a kind of a whisper. "She and her brothers live hereabouts. You'd best keep your distance from that one. She's mean as a polecat, and her brothers are about 10 times worse. Folks around here just try to leave them be." "How many brothers are we talking about?" "Well, I know of 3 for sure. Cain, he's the oldest." "And the girl's name is Jessie, eh?" "Short for Jezebel." he emphasized. Nice. Don't you believe it, friend. Ain't been the man yet to tame that one, and take my word for it, there have been a few that tried. That bad, eh? He shrugged his shoulders and closed the hood. Just so you know. I poked a wad of Red Man into my jaw. So, before noon, you think? I asked, changing the subject. Give or take a half hour. All right, you take care of her, and I'll be back when you're done to settle up with you. I shook his hand and settled the tobacco in my cheek, and then crossed the street, hoping for a second look at Jessie Lucas. She hadn't appeared to be short on attitude, but I still couldn't see how it could be as bad as Levi had made it out. I might have followed her into the store, but a police car pulled in just from down the street. Miss Lucas would have to wait. The cop behind the steering wheel stepped out onto the pavement, and the first thing I noticed was he was Indian. He wore a bomber-style jacket with a bright yellow star pinned to it, and a .357 Ruger Security 6 in his holster. He propped himself against the hood of the patrol car and sorted through a ticket book as I approached him. Uniforms still make me nervous, but according to my good friend Levi, the local law were the only people in the know about Sam and his death. He looked up at me before I could speak. Don't spit on the sidewalk, he ordered. I shook my head. Wouldn't dare. I stretched my neck just so my spittle landed safely in the gutter, but he paid no attention. Then he stood straight and pocketed his book. I met his eyes and offered my hand. I'm Sylvester Logan James, Deputy Whitecrow, he said. You need something? Well, actually, I came to town looking for an old friend of mine, Sam Vargo. You wouldn't know where I could find him. He pushed the sheriff's cap back and scratched his forehead. He's up on Fuller's Ridge, he replied with finality. Where's that? I asked, but I could already guess. It's a cemetery. Sam passed away this summer. Sorry to tell you. I pretended to be slightly surprised. How did it happen? The deputy pulled the bill of his cap down to his eyebrows and stepped away from the car. He died. And he walked into the sheriff's office just behind him. So I spit on the sidewalk and headed for the general store. 3 elderly women filed out through the door as I neared. They were chattering trivial gossip to one another, hushing long enough for me to pass and then resuming. Then the whine of a 2-stroke engine stirred in the air, and then was joined by another, and they grew louder. 2 rice burners, Japanese bikes, coated with dried mud, left a mosquito fog behind them as they skidded to a stop in front of the store. The riders were younger men than I, but mountain-worn and grizzled for their age. The oldest looked to be 30-ish, with wiry black hair and an unkempt goatee. The younger one, probably 19 or so, had long dishwater blonde hair, a rough start of a beard, and a nasty scar across his chin. They were rough as cobs, and no one had to tell me they were Lucas's. Blondie eyeballed me through the fumes as Jezebel pushed through the door past me and climbed up behind the older one on his bike. Without a word, they revved their engines and tore out of there, leaving me in their cloud as they rode off. I thought I saw Jessie look over her shoulder. They tell me it's not a good idea to make plans on an empty stomach, so I turned away from the general store in search of breakfast. The summer was still hanging on, and that particular morning the temperature gave one of its last performances of the season. I found myself removing my vest and unbuttoning my shirt a place or two. The scars at my abdomen ached with the confirmation that it was almost 90 degrees. I questioned my sanity sometimes for throwing away the prescription the doc gave me. The cafe was clean and quaint, with about 10 other people engaged in their morning chit-chat, and no one seemed to notice me as I took a booth near the back. No one but the waitress, who poured me a cup of coffee and took an order for steak and eggs. My mind was cluttered as I blew the steam from my cup, and to be honest, it was a while before the case of Samuel Vargo occupied my thoughts. I began to lose myself in other worlds I had known. So much had happened in the last few years that I found myself almost reeling from the ride, traveling Mach 5 with my hair on fire. Now that I'd come to a screeching halt, it was like all those years of running, like there was no tomorrow, had caught up with me all at once, and with a vengeance. Samantha Clark had been my wife once upon a time, but it had been even longer since I'd been able to see a full moon without the bile of rage swelling in my belly. How long had it been since I'd waded through the jungles of Southeast Asia? I remembered the sound of prison gates slamming. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed, cried, or even been happy, and I wondered if I ever cared for anything or anyone any more than I cared about killing the beast. Up until that moment, I'd never felt so cold, or so old. Things I should have done differently, haunting memories of a life that might have been. I was tormented by so many ghosts, and I knew I should let them go, but that's always been the real trick. I carried all the shit in my life like luggage. I wore them like badges. Dad taught me to let these things turn, and Michael how to turn things off, but no one ever showed me how to just let them go. I wished I knew how. I know it sounds cliche, but I didn't know who I really was. If this is a midlife crisis, you can keep it, I thought. I barely tasted my breakfast, and I didn't notice the clock until it had changed from 7:45 to 9:10. Not until a flash of sunlight gleamed off a badge and struck me square in the eyes. I watched two cops walk in to meet me. One of them was the Indian deputy I'd met. The other was a thickly built man with a neatly waxed handlebar mustache under his nose. They removed their hats as they sauntered towards me, and the waitresses greeted them by name. I pushed aside the cold remnant of a slightly runny eggs and set my cup at the edge of the table for a refill. The lawman now stood over me. Oh, joy. Good morning. I'm Sheriff Biggs, and I believe you know my deputy. Yeah, we've met, I said. Have a seat if you want. They slipped into the bench across the table, and I held out my hand. Sylvester James. Mr. James, he greeted me courteously. Just call me Sylvester, I corrected. Biggs picked up a menu and opened it, feigning interest in the special of the day. John tells me you've come looking for Sam Vargo. That right? Pretty much, I confessed. Mind if I ask you why? Ever notice how a waitress can kill a conversation? All she has to do is stop by. We waited for her to pour our coffee, and then I shot White Crow a curious glance. Pawnee? I observed. No, almost insulted. Flathead and Cree. What about you? Northern Cheyenne? Sometimes I forget it's obvious. Biggs was quietly fidgeting with his spoon, stirring his coffee almost nervously. He reminded me of his question. I know it's none of my business, he said. It's just that I didn't think Sam had any friends. Seems a little odd for one to show up out of town. And now, he mused, suspiciously, I thought. I decided to play straight with the sheriff, mostly because I didn't see what I had to lose. The whole thing was still kind of cryptic to me. I snagged the envelope from my vest and gave it to Biggs. Vargo sent me that letter around the 1st of June. Go ahead, read it, I invited. The yellowish parchment read, Mr. James, you can understand the kind of trouble that's knocking at my door. My house is made out of bricks, but I'm not safe. Come to Skowak, B.C. soon. I will pay you anything you ask. Samuel Vargo. The sheriff studied the letter momentarily, then handed it to John, who handed it back to me after a once-over. Biggs twisted the end of his mustache. What's that supposed to mean? He sighed. Hell, I didn't know Sam could read or write, let alone had pen pals. So this is the point where shooting straight has its disadvantages. I ran an outfitter company in Winnipeg, I began. I used it as a base of operations and not just for guiding hunts. I don't know how Sam got my address, but the imagery of the letter tells me he needed an expert. Both their brows were bunched in confusion. An expert, he mulled. On what? I took a deep breath, prepared to lower the boom. Killing werewolves, I said offhandedly. They didn't react in typical fashion. They didn't get up and walk away. They didn't break up laughing, and they didn't give me that look that says you're nuts. They just sat there with their faces unflinching, and then the sheriff put his arm on the table and aimed a finger at me. If that's supposed to be funny, nobody's laughing. Nobody would be, I assured him. They knew something more than the heart attack story. That was evident from the little pools of fear that danced in Big's eyes. After a while, the sheriff relaxed his arm and looked away from my eyes. His voice wasn't much more than a whisper when he spoke again. My other deputy, Carl DuPont, said he saw you drive into town with Manitoba tags. You want me to believe that you came all that way because a stranger wrote you a letter? That's right, I said. I'm sure not a skier, and even if I was, I don't see any snow out here. The fear pools were getting larger by the minute. All right, now you listen to me, he instructed. I want to know what's going on with you, and I want to know right now. How did he die, Sheriff? And don't tell me a massive coronary. I heard that one before. You trying to play jump rope with me? I lowered my own voice and leaned a little over the table. I'm being as square with you as I know how to be. It may be unbelievable to you, but I'll bet that farm that old Vargo believed it right up till the end. I'm not a charlatan, and I'm not a Looney Tune. I'm a serious fucking man. You know more than I do about Samuel. So you help me, and I'll help you. Because, brother, if he died like I think he did, you're going to need me. I punctuated it with a knuckle to the table. Biggs and White Crow exchanged glances. I knew from the look in their eyes they believed me, even if they didn't want to. Why would a man write someone he's never met? White Crow asked. Word about me gets around in circles of the desperate, I said. Sheriff Biggs squinted his eyes closed and put his hands out in front of him like he was trying to visualize something. Let me understand this. Then he paused. You kill monsters. Just werewolves, I said. Look, if you don't want to tell me about him, I'll just start asking around. You guys can't be the only ones who knew him. Now hold it right there, Biggs said. You want to know about Sam, I'll tell you. He was kind of a mountain man, a hermit, if you like. Kind of a spooky around people, but he never made any trouble. He'd come into town once or twice a year, and you could talk to him just like anybody else. He didn't care. But he didn't care for company either, and I don't know much more about the man than that. That's the way he wanted it. But do you know how he died? I pressed him. Maybe, he said, honestly, for the first time. And what does maybe mean? It means now I'm scared to say for sure. I plucked a cigarillo from my shirt pocket and set it afire as the deputy picked up on the dialogue just above a whisper. Everybody thinks it was a heart attack. I mean, he was an old man. But the truth is, something killed him. He exhaled. Something, I asked through a fog of my smoke. He looked down at his coffee cup. An animal, some kind of an animal, he stammered dismissively. There were no other customers within earshot, but our hushed conversation had people looking over their shoulders just the same. The sheriff's tension radiated from him like a furnace at this point, and he said, If we have to talk about this, I suggest we do it somewhere else. Their pack radios crackled with static as a voice on the other side of it called for assistance with a traffic accident. White Crow responded, slammed his last gulp of coffee, and bolted for the door without another word, which left me with Biggs. I tapped an ash from my cigarillo into the ashtray and watched the sheriff think. His thoughts weren't on the hit and run. They were on me. I could almost feel the struggle between his logic and his fear. He was trying to decide if he should level with me or escort my ass to the city limits. I gave him that little extra nudge I knew he needed. I am not fucking with you, Sheriff, and the fact that you haven't shown me the way out of town yet is a pretty good sign you believe it. He pulled some bills from his wallet and sat them under the salt shaker, as though I hadn't said anything. Then he slid out of the booth, and he said, Yet being the operative word. Breakfast's on me. Come on. His office was a small room with dusty furnishings and propped open windows. Dust particles sifted through the invading sunlight, and the air smelled like ink and paper. I was on the lookout for bullshit from him, too, but so far I hadn't smelled any of that. He stood beside his desk and poured 2 more cups of coffee as I crushed out my smoke on the heel of my boot. He continued to size me up as he sat in his tape-repaired desk chair. His fear had won. I sat quietly with a mug in my hands. It was his move. Werewolves, he mumbled as though it were the sum of his soul. I hunt them down, and I killed them, I said. It was my resume.
All right, so that was part one of Spirits in the Silence. I hope you will forgive my narration skills. This was actually the first time in those 30 years that I've read this story, let alone aloud. So if you liked it, you want to hear more, let me know in the comment section down below. You can send me a message on Facebook, where you can find me under Brian P. Easton or Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter. You can also drop me a line if you want to at brian@werewolfhunter.com. And our website is www.werewolfhunter.com. Thanks for liking and subscribing, and for spending a few minutes with us this evening. Until we meet again, happy hunting and mind the moon.